There are moments in a life when everything you think you understand about the world gets very, very quiet. When something older than language steps forward and takes the wheel. Most people miss those moments entirely. They are moving too fast. They are too busy being certain. But sometimes, if you are lucky, or if something refuses to let you stay blind, you get to feel it. The ground shifts. The animal stops. And everything you thought you knew rearranges itself into something truer, and more humble, and far more strange. This is a story about one of those moments. It is a story about a man named Elliot Marsh, a horse named Roan, in a morning in the high country when the earth opened up and showed them both what it had been holding underneath. It is also a story about what it costs to almost not listen. The morning Elliot Marsh saddled Roan for the last leg of the autumn drive, the sky was the color of old pewter. Not threatening, just heavy. The kind of sky that doesn't promise anything, not rain, not sun, just sits above the world like a held breath, waiting for something to decide. The air had that particular smell of late October at elevation. Cold and mineral and faintly smoky from somewhere far off, a ranch fire or a controlled burn on the lower slopes. The smell of a season ending. Elliot had been awake since 4:30. Not from anxiety, just from the habit of early rising that had calcified in him over decades of ranching life, the way all habits do when they have been practiced long enough to become indistinguishable from instinct. He had made coffee in the dark, eaten cold biscuits from the previous night's supper, and pulled on his coat against the chill before the first gray light had even thought about appearing on the ridgeline. Roan was waiting in the small overnight corral they had set up near the tree line. He was already awake, standing near the gate with the composed patience of an animal that has learned, over 14 years, that mornings always begin the same way and will not be hurried. He accepted the saddle without drama. He accepted the bridle with the same quiet resignation he brought to most things. His breath rose in small clouds in the cold air, and his coat, the deep reddish tan that gave him his name, was thick now with the autumn growth, the hair standing slightly longer than in summer, the color darkened by the season. Elliot tightened the cinch, checked the saddlebags, and swung up. Roan stood steady beneath him. He always did. They had been 3 days on this drive. Elliot and his nephew, a boy of 19 named Cole, were moving 42 head of cattle from the upper pastures down to the winter lowlands, a route that cut through a stretch of high open country that from a distance looked like the simplest terrain in the world. Flat, pale, treeless. The kind of landscape that invites you to stop paying attention because everything seems obvious. But Elliot had grown up in this country and he knew that the surface appearance of this particular stretch meant nothing. Underneath the flat expanse ran old water channels, mineral seams, zones where the substrate had been slowly hollowed out by decades of underground drainage. It was the kind of terrain that tested you not by being dramatic but by being deceptive. By looking exactly like the ground everywhere else, right up until it wasn't. He had crossed it a dozen times without incident. He had never thought much about what lay beneath. Cole was riding point, half a mile ahead, a small figure against the gray sky and the pale autumn grass, pushing the herd at an easy pace. Elliot could hear them, distantly, the low percussion of hoofs, the occasional call. The back of the herd ambled past him in loose groups, steam rising from their backs in the cold morning air, content as cattle generally are when they are moving somewhere that isn't uphill. Elliot's coffee had gone cold in the thermos an hour ago. His back ached the way it always ached after the second day in the saddle, a deep, specific ache in his lower right side that he had learned to carry as a kind of companion, familiar and manageable. He was thinking about supper, about the bunkhouse, about the warmth of a room with walls and the particular pleasure of unlacing his boots at the end of a day and letting his feet exist freely in the world again. He was thinking, in other words, about the end of the thing, not the thing itself. The way you do when you are almost done and you can feel the finish within reach. He was not thinking about the ground. Roan stopped. It was not a gradual thing. Not the slow deceleration that happens when a horse notices something in its peripheral vision and takes a moment to process it before deciding whether to worry. This was immediate and total. A full, committed stop, like a switch thrown. Elliot lurched slightly in the saddle, caught himself on the horn, and looked around. Nothing. Open ground ahead of him. The pale dry grass moving faintly in the low wind. The tail end of the herd maybe 70 yards ahead, moving normally, no disturbance, no scattering. The sky still gray. The same flat expanse he had been crossing for the past half hour, unchanged, unremarkable. He clicked his tongue, pressed his heels gently into Roan's flanks. The horse did not move. He tried again, firmer this time, a deliberate signal that should have produced a response. Roan shifted his weight, but not forward, backward. One step, slow and deliberate, then another. The movement of an animal backing away from something it had seen and had decided needed distance. Something that Elliot, for all his looking, could not identify. The first thread of frustration pulled through him. He scanned the terrain again, more carefully. He checked the saddle, nothing loose, nothing that would create discomfort. He checked his own position, wondering if he was communicating something without meaning to, some tension in his body that Roan was reading his instruction. But no. He was relaxed. He was sitting naturally. There was nothing there. He pulled the reins back, not cruelly but firmly. We need to move. We're behind. The herd is ahead of us and the valley is waiting, and I am cold and my back hurts and I want this day finished. Roan's ears were forward. Both of them, locked in that sharp, still, forward position that Elliot knew meant the horse was focused, not distracted, not scanning generally, but zeroed in. Both ears aimed at the ground roughly 40 meters ahead. His nostrils were wide. His neck carried a tension Elliot could feel through the saddle, through the leather, through his thighs and his calves, and even through the hands resting on the horn. The horse's whole body was broadcasting something in a frequency that Elliot didn't know how to receive. He did not stop to learn how. He pulled harder. Roan took one step forward. One, under pressure, and then planted all 4 feet with a firmness that communicated, as clearly as anything Elliot had ever heard in words, that this was as far as they were going. The horse dropped his head slightly, ears still locked forward, body still vibrating with that quiet, concentrated tension, and simply refused. Elliot exhaled. He sat for a moment, feeling the frustration build and then settle. He gathered the reins. He prepared to insist one more time, because there was no earthly reason he could see for this behavior, and because the bunkhouse and the supper were waiting. And then something stopped him. He couldn't say afterward what it was exactly. A sound, maybe, though he wasn't certain he heard anything. Or the absence of sound, a sudden specific silence that fell over that stretch of ground like a cloth over a table, smoothing everything out, making the world very still. The kind of silence that doesn't feel like emptiness but like presence. Like something holding its breath. He sat. Roan had not moved. Was not moving. The horse was watching the ground ahead with an intensity that in that moment felt, to Elliot, almost indistinguishable from understanding. Not animal instinct, not reflex, but something that looked very much like knowledge. Like a quiet, absolute certainty that he was the only one of the two of them who knew what was about to happen. 3 seconds of stillness. Then Elliot felt it. It didn't come through his ears. It came through his body, a low, deep vibration traveling up through the stirrups, through the saddle leather, through Roan's back, into the base of Elliot's spine. A sensation more than a sound. Like a slow exhalation from deep underground. Like something shifting its weight at a great depth. Something hollow, adjusting. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. and then the ground 40 meters ahead simply opened. Not violently. Not with the explosive drama that you might expect from the earth deciding to give way. It did it the way old things surrender, the way a snow-laden branch finally bends, the way a wall at the end of its life leans and then falls, with a kind of tired inevitability, the surface crumbling inward and downward into a dark void that had been waiting beneath it for longer than any of them had been alive. A natural collapse. A sinkhole. The underground chamber that had been forming, silently and invisibly, over years and decades of mineral erosion, had finally reached the point where the crust above it was too thin to hold. And it let go. The sound came a half-second after the sight. A deep, percussive thud, like a drumbeat from inside the earth, followed by the hissing rush of displaced soil and rock tumbling into the darkness below. A cloud of pale dust rose from the edge of the collapse and drifted sideways in the wind. Then silence again. Elliot sat completely still in the saddle. He was aware of his heartbeat, which had gone rapid and then was slowly steadying. Aware of Roan's breathing, steady and even, still watching the collapsed earth ahead with those calm, forward-locked eyes. The horse had not startled at the collapse itself. Had not flinched or skittered or done any of the things a frightened animal does. He had simply stood, as though he had been waiting for the rest of the world to catch up to what he had already known. And now that it had, there was nothing left to do but stand. Elliot looked at the collapsed ground. He looked at the distance between it and the place where they were standing. He calculated, roughly, where they would have been if Roan had complied with his first command, and his second, and his third. He thought about the angle of their approach and the pace they had been moving. He didn't let himself finish the calculation all the way. Some outcomes are clear enough from the direction they're pointing without needing to be followed to their end. He reached forward and laid one hand flat against Roan's neck, just below the mane, in the place where the hair grows in a slight whirl and the skin is warm. He held it there for a moment, not patting, not rubbing, just holding. The contact of one living thing acknowledging another. "All right," he said quietly. Not loud enough for anyone to hear, out there in the open country with the dust still settling in the cold sky overhead. It was barely more than breath. "All right. I hear you." Roan's ear flicked once in his direction. Then forward again. Then, slowly, the tension left the animal's neck and shoulders, the way tension does when the thing that required it has passed. The horse lowered his head and exhaled, a long, slow breath from deep in his chest. They stood there together for a while. The man and the horse in the collapsed earth and the cold morning. Elliot Marsh had grown up with horses. His father had kept a small working string on a property outside Laramie. His grandfather had ranched the same high country before him, and his grandfather's father before that, a chain of men who had moved through this landscape for 4 generations, always learning and always finding out how much more there was still to learn. Elliot had been in the saddle since he was 4 years old. By any measure, by any standard he had ever been held to or held himself to, he knew horses. He would tell you, in the years before that October morning, that he understood them the way you understand a skilled and reliable tool. You learned its personality, its quirks, its preferences and aversions. You built a working relationship grounded in consistency and fairness. This was mastery, of a kind. He was proud of it, quietly. But understanding, in his conception of it, had always traveled in one direction. The human understood the horse. The human was the one with the broader context, the one who knew where they were going and why, the one making decisions based on information the animal couldn't access. That was the arrangement. He had not seriously entertained what it might mean if it went the other way. If there was something the horse knew that he didn't. Not a quirk, not a momentary fright, but genuine knowledge. Specific, accurate, life-saving information about the world that the animal possessed and the man did not. It had simply not seemed possible in the framework he had built. The ground changed his framework. Cole came back along the fence line an hour later, riding the thin-legged bay he'd been on for the whole drive, wondering what was keeping the rear of the herd. He came around the scrub brush at a trot and then pulled up short when he saw what was in front of him. The collapsed ground, still edged with fresh crumbled soil, the dark void at its center. His uncle sitting on a flat rock 20 meters from the edge, drinking cold coffee from the thermos. Roan ground-tied nearby, cropping dry grass with the easy contentment of an animal that has done what needed doing and is now simply getting on with his afternoon. Cole looked at the hole, looked at the horse, looked at his uncle, whose face was doing something Cole hadn't seen it do before. Not an expression, exactly, but the absence of several normal expressions. The absence of impatience. The absence of forward momentum. A quality of stillness that Cole associated with men who had just understood something that had rearranged their interior furniture. "You all right?" Cole asked. "Yeah," Elliot said. A pause that lasted a full half-minute. "Roan stopped," Elliot said. He gestured vaguely at the space between the rock and the edge of the hole. "Before it went. He stopped and he wouldn't go. I was trying to get him moving." He turned the thermos in his hands. He already knew. Cole looked at the horse again. Roan did not look back. He was focused on the grass, which presented no philosophical difficulties. "How did he know?" Cole asked. Elliot was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said. "I've been sitting here trying to work that out." He looked up at his nephew. "I think that might be the wrong question." They rerouted the herd along the east fence line and brought them down by dark. 42 head accounted for, no losses, the cattle moving through the last of the afternoon light with their usual unhurried solemnity into the lower pastures. The sky had cleared as the day progressed, and by the time they reached the valley the evening was cold and brilliant, the stars beginning to show above the eastern ridgeline before the sun had fully left the western one. Cole was asleep in his bunkhouse chair by 9, his boots still on, his coffee half drunk. Elliot sat by the small window and looked out into the darkness of the corral and thought. He was not, generally, a man given to extended reflection. The life he led was practical and physical and left little space for the abstract. There were always things to be done, things to be managed, problems to be solved with tools and labor and the accumulated knowledge of how this particular piece of land worked. Introspection felt, on most days, like a luxury that the ranch did not budget for. But the day had cracked something open in him, and he found he couldn't close it again. He thought about Roan's ears. The precise, forward-locked angle of them in the moment before the collapse, aimed at the ground like instruments tuned to a frequency he couldn't access. He thought about the tension in the horse's body, distributed through every muscle and tendon, a whole-body form of attention that he now understood had been receiving information from the ground itself. The subtle vibrations of undermined substrate, transmitted through 4 hooves in contact with the surface, interpreted by a nervous system refined over tens of thousands of years of prey animals learning to read the earth beneath their feet for things that wanted to kill them. He thought about what the horse had known, and about what he had not known, and about the gap between those two things. He had looked at the ground with his human eyes and seen, flat, pale, safe. He had applied his human experience, 12 crossings of this stretch without incident, the absence of any visible warning, and arrived at a conclusion. Go forward. And he had been completely, almost fatally, wrong. Not because he was careless. Not because he was foolish. But because the information that would have changed his conclusion was not available to his senses. It existed in a register he couldn't read. It had been there, the whole time, present and clear and available, just not to him. To Roan it had been obvious. Elliot thought about the 3 times he had given the signal to go forward. Each one a little firmer, each one a little more insistent. He thought about the step forward the horse had taken under that final pressure, the one step of compliance, before planting all 4 feet and refusing further. He thought about what that moment had cost the animal, the conflict between the imperative to obey and the imperative to not walk onto ground it knew would kill them both. The quiet, stubborn, animal courage of choosing the second imperative over the first. He thought about how close he had come to forcing the issue. Outside, in the dark of the corral, he could see Roan's outline against the fence. The horse was standing with one hind leg cocked, his head low, in the easy, boneless posture of an animal half asleep. 14 years old. A scar on his left shoulder. Worn hooves and a thick autumn coat in the simple appetite of a creature that eats and rests and endures. Nothing about him suggested mystery. Nothing announced the extraordinary thing that had happened that morning on the high ridge. And yet, Elliot thought about trust. Not the kind of trust that comes easily, the kind that is essentially just comfort and familiarity dressed up as something deeper. The kind that requires you to give up something. That requires you to admit the limits of your own knowledge and create a space for a knowing that isn't yours. The kind that looks, from the outside, like letting go of the wheel. He had not been good at that kind of trust. He understood this about himself in a way he hadn't before that morning. He had been good at the other kind, the trust that was really just reliance, the way you rely on a hammer to drive a nail, knowing its weight and its balance. That trust asked nothing of you. It required only competence. The harder kind asked for humility. He sat by the window until the fire died down and the room went cold, and then he went to bed. In the morning there would be fence lines to check, water sources to assess, a dozen other practical things waiting. The ranch did not pause for philosophical recalibration. But something had changed. He could feel it in him, settled and quiet, the way water settles after you stop disturbing it. A new arrangement of certain interior furniture. A small cleared space where absolute certainty about certain things used to live. He did not mourn the certainty. He found, somewhat to his surprise, that he did not miss it at all. He told the story over the years, not often and not with drama, but to certain people at certain times. Usually when the conversation turned, as it does among ranchers on long evenings, to the question of what animals know and what they don't. He was careful in the telling. He never claimed to understand it. He never explained what he hadn't been able to explain, never wrapped it in a theory that made it tidier than it was. He would just say, "I was trying to get him to move." And the horse wouldn't go. And then the ground opened up in exactly the place we would have been. And then he would say, with the flatness of a man stating a fact, he already knew. And he would let that sit there in the silence. The people who had spent years with horses would nod. Not with the nod of people hearing something new, but with the nod of people hearing a thing confirmed that they had long suspected but not found the words for. They had their own versions of the story, most of them, stored somewhere in the personal archive of experiences that don't fit the ordinary categories. A horse that refused a jump that turned out to have rotten footing underneath. An animal that wouldn't load into a trailer that was later found to have a cracked frame. Small things, some of them, that had added up over years to a working theory of equine knowledge that none of them had the vocabulary to articulate, but all of them, on some level, trusted. The people who had not spent time with horses would get a different look. Not quite skepticism. Elliot was too grounded a man, too obviously not given to embellishment, for the story to feel like fabrication. More like the look of someone standing at the edge of something larger than they expected. That was usually where Elliot stopped. Because the point wasn't to convince anyone. The point was to point at something. The way you might point at a shadow at the edge of a field and say, "There is something there. I can't show it to you directly. But if you're still for long enough, you might catch it." And if you're still here with this story, still listening, still in this quiet with us, then maybe you already know what that kind of stillness feels like. You're welcome to leave a like or share a thought in the comments. This little corner of storytelling exists because people like you stay. And that matters more than you might think. The winter that year was hard. 3 feet of snow on the high country by December, the passes closed, the lower pastures holding but barely, the days short and the light thin and the mornings dark for so long it felt sometimes like the dark was the rule and the light was the exception. The herd came through well enough. The fences held. The water sources froze and were broken open again and froze again, the eternal repetition of winter ranching that requires patience more than any other quality. Elliot rode Roan through most of it, checking fence lines and water sources in the cold, moving through a landscape that had gone white and very quiet, the snow muffling everything, the world reduced to the crunch of hoofs and the breath of the horse and the distant sound of wind across the ridgeline. On those rides, he changed how he rode. He let the reins go loose and simply followed, not abandoning his direction entirely, but creating space within the ride for the horse to move as he chose, to respond to the ground as he read it. He began to notice things he had never paid attention to before. The way Roan's stride changed in ground that looked solid but had subsurface softness. The way his ears tracked threats and information simultaneously, one forward, one swiveling, processing the world from 2 angles at once. He was learning a language, slowly and late and imperfectly, but learning it nonetheless. He stopped assuming he was the only one doing the reading. That was the core of it, he thought. That was the thing that had changed. He had always been reading the world, the weather, the ground, the condition of the herd. He was good at it. But he had been reading it alone, gathering information from his own instruments and making decisions in his own processing room and issuing instructions downward. The morning on the ridge had made it clear that his instruments were incomplete, that there were registers of information he simply did not have access to, and that the animal he had been issuing instructions to had been accessing those registers all along. He thought about what the partnership might have been, all those years, if he had understood that earlier. Not a man directing a horse, but 2 intelligences, different in kind and in their particular areas of competence, moving through the world together, each offering what the other lacked. The horse's ancient, embodied knowledge of the physical world. The man's longer view of where they were going and why. It seemed like it should have been obvious. Roan lived to be 23. By his last few years he was semi-retired, turned out in the lower pasture with a gentle old mare named Frances who had been on the property almost as long. He still moved well. The arthritis that had begun to show in his hind joints did not seem to slow him much, or if it did, he had decided not to let it show in any obvious way, the characteristic restraint of a self-possessed animal. He grazed in the long evenings with the ease of a creature that had made its peace with the particular shape of its life and found nothing there to complain about. Elliot visited him daily, in those last years. Not to work him, just to be near him. He would lean on the fence for 20 minutes in the evening light and watch the horse eat, which was not a particularly dramatic thing to watch, and which he found, nonetheless, entirely satisfying in a way he couldn't explain to anyone who asked. The afternoon Roan died was a Thursday in late October, almost exactly 12 years after the morning on the ridge. The same season. The same gray pewter sky. The same cold and mineral smell in the air. Cole, who was 31 now and had his own small operation 2 valleys over, drove out to be there. They didn't say much. There wasn't much that needed saying. Elliot sat beside the horse on the ground, which was cold and damp with the autumn, and put his hand against that broad warm neck one more time. In the same place, below the mane, where the hair grew in a slight whirl. He held it there and felt the warmth of the animal beneath his palm, in the slowing of the breath, in the particular stillness that descends when something very large and very alive begins to become something else. He thought about the morning on the ridge, about the hell-breath sky and the pale open ground and the horse that had stopped and would not go, about the 3 insistent signals the horse had received and quietly declined, about the step forward under pressure and then the 4 feet planted, in the long moment of stillness before the earth confirmed what the animal had known all along. He thought about what it meant to be carried by something you didn't fully understand. Not blindly, he had never been able to do anything blindly, it wasn't in his constitution, but with a kind of earned, eyes-open surrender to the fact that some information exists outside your own instruments. That some wisdom operates in registers you cannot access on your own. That the partnership, when you finally understand what it is richer and stranger and more mutual than you imagined. He thought, I was lucky. And then, in the way that truer things often follow the first attempt, no. Not lucky. Carried. Carried by 14 years of honest partnership. By an animal that never once made up a problem it didn't have, never once refused without cause, never once performed the things it felt in order to manage his reactions. By a horse that had simply, on one particular morning, known something that he didn't, and had chosen, under pressure, against instruction, at the cost of conflict with the one person whose commands it was designed to follow, to act on what it knew. The evening light went gold and then went pink and then went the deep blue-purple of autumn dusk in the mountains, the color that only exists for about 20 minutes and then is gone. The color that makes the world look like it is ending beautifully and you have nothing to do but witness it. Elliot sat with his hand on the horse's neck until the light was completely gone. Cole came and stood beside him for a while in the dark, not saying anything. The mare Frances was nearby, standing quietly, aware in the way animals are aware of these things, that something final was occurring. Then Cole put a hand briefly on his uncle's shoulder and went back to the house to make something warm. Elliot stayed a little longer. He stayed until the cold had settled fully into his joints and the stars above the valley were the kind that only appear when the air is perfectly dry and the lights of any city are very far away. Until there was nothing left to do but stand up and walk back to the house and accept the mug of coffee that Cole handed him without a word. He sat in the chair by the window, the one he had sat in 12 years before on the night after the ridge, and drank the coffee while it was still hot this time. He looked out at the dark corral, which was empty now in a way it had not been empty in 14 years. He thought about the learning that had begun on a cold October morning when a horse planted 4 feet in the ground and refused to move, and kept refusing, until the earth itself proved the animal right. He thought about what it meant to share a world with other kinds of knowing. To move through terrain that holds information and registers you cannot access. To accept that your instruments are not the only instruments in the field. He thought about the listening. There are things in this world that do not come through the ordinary channels. That do not announce themselves in language, do not explain their reasoning, do not wait for you to catch up. They come through the soles of hooves on hollow ground. Through the tilt of an ear toward a frequency below human hearing. Through 14 years of a horse never once inventing a problem, in the one morning when it mattered, refusing to move. The most important information you will ever receive may not arrive in a form you recognize. It may not fit the categories you have built. It may come from something you have been in daily contact with for years without ever fully understanding. It may require you to stop talking, stop insisting, stop being so completely certain you already know, and simply allow the knowledge that exists outside your own instruments to reach you. Sometimes the wisest thing in the room is the one that can't speak. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is nothing. Just stop. Just wait. Just be still long enough for an older intelligence to tell you what it knows. Roan knew. The ground ahead was hollow. The crust was thin. The path that looked clear was not clear. He felt it in his hoofs and through the bones of his legs and into his chest, the way animals have always felt the world, not with the mediated, symbol processing, language-filtered awareness that humans call knowing, but with the whole body, the whole organism, every sense, in every instinct aligned toward a single, unambiguous conclusion. And he refused. Quietly, firmly, without drama, with the patient persistence of something that understood it was right and was willing to stand in that understanding for as long as it took. He stood there for Elliot. He stood there despite Elliot. He stood there because there was no version of the morning in which he was going to let the man he had carried for 14 years walk out onto ground that would swallow him. That is the story. Not of a horse that predicted the future. Not of something miraculous in the sense of violating the laws of the physical world. But of a different kind of knowing, available to different instruments than the ones Elliot had brought to that morning, operating in a register he had not known how to read, and of the animal that carried that knowledge and the quiet courage to act on it, and the man who, just in time, went still enough to receive it. The gray sky, the cold air, the hollow ground, the 4 feet planted, the held breath, and then, finally, the listening. If this story stayed with you a little longer than most things do, you are welcome to leave a like or share a thought in the comments below. Every word you leave means something to us here. And if you would like to return to stories told this slowly, this quietly, from this particular place between the true and the almost true, you can find us here whenever you need somewhere still to land. We will be here. Subscribe if you want to stay a while. We would be glad to have you.